The mockery. Thomas Green had never been comfortable with attention, which made the laughter echoing through the aircraft factory floor that much harder to bear. He stood in the center of the maintenance bay, his weathered hands clutching crude sketch, while a circle of engineers and supervisors gathered around him like wolves, circling wounded prey. "You want us to do what?" Senior engineer Harold Pemberton's voice dripped with condescension as he snatched the paper from Thomas's grip. The drawing showed a series of modifications to the fuel line system of the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers they manufactured. "This is... Thomas, you're a riveter. You put pieces together. You don't redesign critical aircraft systems." Thomas's jaw tightened. At 47, he'd spent the last 30 years working with metal, first in his father's automotive shop in Detroit, then in various manufacturing plants before the war brought him here to the Boeing plant in Seattle. He knew machines. He understood how things moved, how fluids flowed, how pressure built and released. But he had no degree, no credentials, no letters after his name that would make these men listen. "Sir, if you just look at the compression ratios," Thomas began, but Pemberton cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Compression ratios? Good God, man. Do you even know what that means?" The other engineers chuckled, and Thomas felt his face burn. "These bombers are already in production. The design has been approved by the best aeronautical engineers in the country. What makes you think you, a factory worker who barely finished high school, could spot something they missed?" Thomas had spotted it 3 weeks ago, during a routine inspection of a return bomber that had barely made it back from a raid over Germany. The crew reported fuel system failures, engine sputtering at critical moments. When Thomas examined the fuel lines, he saw the problem immediately. The positioning of the fuel pumps created vapor lock under certain altitude and temperature conditions. It was a flaw that would seem minor on paper, but could prove fatal in the air. "Men are dying up there," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I've seen 12 bombers come back with fuel system problems this month alone. How many didn't make it back?" The laughter died, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Pemberton's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting our design is killing our boys?" "That is a serious accusation, Green. One that could get you fired, or worse, investigated for sabotage." "I'm not accusing anyone," Thomas replied, meeting the engineer's glare. "I'm trying to help. If you just test what I'm suggesting." "We're not wasting resources on the wild theories of a riveter," Pemberton interrupted, crumpling the sketch and tossing it into a nearby waste bin. "Get back to your station, Green. And keep your ideas to yourself unless you want to find yourself assembling bicycles instead of bombers." The crowd dispersed, leaving Thomas alone in the bay. He waited until the footsteps faded, then retrieved his crumpled sketch from the trash. His hand smoothed out the wrinkles as his mind raced. He couldn't let this go. Somewhere over Europe, young men were climbing into bombers that might fail them at the worst possible moment. Their lives depended on every rivet, every weld, every system working perfectly. Thomas folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. If the engineers wouldn't listen, he'd have to find another way. The question was how, and how much he was willing to risk to make them see the truth. The secret project. Thomas's wife, Margaret, noticed a change in him immediately. He'd always been quiet, methodical, but now he barely spoke during dinner, his eyes distant, calculating. At night, after she'd gone to bed, she could hear him in the garage, the clink of tools and the scratch of pencil on paper filtering through the walls. "You're going to get yourself fired," she said one morning, setting his coffee down with more force than necessary. "Or arrested. Whatever you're doing, Tom, it's not worth it." He looked up from his breakfast, surprised to find her standing there with her arms crossed, worry etched into every line of her face. "I'm trying to save lives, Maggie. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it eating at you?" Her voice softened. "But you can't fight the whole system alone. Those engineers, they have the power, the credentials. You're just a factory worker," Thomas finished, the words bitter on his tongue. "I know." Margaret sat down across from him, reaching for his hand. "That's not what I meant. You're brilliant with your hands, with machines. Everyone knows that. But maybe this time you have to accept that it's out of your control." Thomas wanted to agree, to let it go, to return to the simple satisfaction of his workstation where he knew exactly what was expected of him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those young pilots, boys really, trusting their lives to machines that carried a fatal flaw. That night, he made a decision. If he couldn't convince the engineers with drawings and theories, he'd prove it another way. He'd build a working model that demonstrated the problem and his solution. It would take time, money they didn't have, and resources he'd have to acquire carefully. But it was the only path forward. The next day at the factory, Thomas began his secret project. He started small, pocketing damaged fuel line components that were destined for scrap, salvaging pressure gauges from rejected instruments, collecting pieces that individually meant nothing but together could create his proof. He was careful, timing his acquisitions when supervisors were occupied, when the chaos of shift changes provided cover. In his garage, Thomas constructed a scale model of the B-17's fuel system. He worked from memory and from stolen glances at technical manuals in the factory library. Each night, he tested his theory, running calculations by hand, adjusting variables, seeking the precise conditions that created the vapor lock problem. He used kerosene instead of aviation fuel, rigging a pump system from old automotive parts. Weeks passed. Thomas grew thinner, the shadows under his eyes deepening. Margaret stopped asking questions, instead leaving him sandwiches in the garage and checking on him only to ensure he hadn't collapsed from exhaustion. She understood now that this wasn't stubbornness or pride. This was purpose. The breakthrough came on a cold November night. Thomas had recreated the altitude pressure differentials using a vacuum chamber he'd improvised from a pressure cooker and some copper piping. As he adjusted the temperature and pressure to match conditions at 20,000 feet, the kerosene flow sputtered and stopped, just as he predicted. The vapor lock was real, reproducible, deadly. But more importantly, when he implemented his modification, a simple repositioning of the fuel pump with an additional bypass valve, the flow remained steady even under the most extreme conditions his makeshift lab could create. Thomas stood back, staring at his creation with a mixture of triumph and dread. He had the proof. Now he needed someone who would look at it, really look at it, without the prejudice that had blinded Pemberton and the others. Someone with the authority to force a change. He thought of Colonel James Mitchell, the Air Force liaison officer who occasionally toured the factory floor. Mitchell was a combat veteran, a pilot who'd flown missions himself before being reassigned production oversight. More importantly, Thomas had seen how the colonel treated the workers, with respect, asking questions, actually listening to their concerns. It was a gamble. Going over Pemberton's head could end Thomas's career at the factory, could mark him as a troublemaker, but doing nothing meant more men would die. The choice, when he really thought about it, wasn't a choice at all. The gamble, getting to Colonel Mitchell, proved more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. The officer visited the factory floor regularly, but always surrounded by managers and engineers, always moving quickly from station to station on carefully orchestrated tours. Thomas couldn't just approach him in front of Pemberton without risking immediate dismissal. He needed a different strategy. Through careful observation and discreet questions to the administrative staff, Thomas learned that Colonel Mitchell arrived early every Tuesday morning, conducting private inspections before the factory floor became crowded. It was his way of seeing the operation without the manufactured efficiency that always accompanied official visits. On a Tuesday in late November, Thomas arrived at the factory an hour before his shift. He carried a worn leather satchel containing his model, his calculations, and photographs he'd taken of the problematic fuel systems in return bombers. His heart hammered as he made his way through the semi-darkness of the maintenance bay, searching for the colonel. He found Mitchell in the engine testing area, examining a newly installed Wright Cyclone engine with the focused attention of someone who understood that details mattered. The colonel was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a career pilot and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Colonel Mitchell, sir?" Thomas's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "I need 5 minutes of your time. It's about a critical safety issue with the B-17 fuel systems." Mitchell turned, one eyebrow raised. He took in Thomas's work clothes, the grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, the satchel clutched like a lifeline. And you are? Thomas Green, sir. I'm a riveter here. I know how this sounds, but I've discovered a design flaw that's causing fuel system failures. I have proof. The colonel's expression remained neutral, but he didn't dismiss Thomas outright. You realize making accusations about design flaws is a serious matter? These systems have been tested extensively. Yes, sir. I know, and I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain. Thomas set his satchel on a nearby workbench and began unpacking his model. I've been documenting fuel system failures in return bombers for months. There's a pattern. Vapor lock occurs under specific altitude and temperature conditions that the current design doesn't account for. Mitchell stepped closer, his interest clearly piqued. Show me. For the next 20 minutes, Thomas demonstrated his findings. He showed the colonel the failure points, explained the physics involved, and most importantly, ran his model through the conditions that caused the problem. Mitchell asked sharp, technical questions that Thomas answered with confidence born from months of obsessive research. And you designed the solution? Mitchell asked, examining the bypass valve modification. Yes, sir. It's not elegant, but it works. I've tested it hundreds of times. The modification is simple enough that it could be implemented quickly, and it could be retrofitted to existing bombers in the field. Mitchell was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the modified fuel lines on Thomas's model. Why didn't you take this to the engineering department? Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. I did, sir. Senior Engineer Pemberton dismissed it, said I was just a factory worker who didn't understand aeronautical engineering. I see. Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And so you build all this yourself? On your own time? Yes, sir. I couldn't let it go. Every mission that goes out, I wonder if today's the day one of those bombers doesn't make it back because of something I could have fixed. The colonel studied Thomas for a long moment, and Thomas couldn't read what he saw in those sharp eyes. Then Mitchell nodded, as if coming to a decision. Mr. Green, what you've shown me today is either the most important discovery this factory has made or an elaborate waste of my time. I'm inclined to believe it's the former. He glanced at his watch. I'm ordering a full engineering review of the B-17 fuel system, specifically focused on the issues you've identified, and you're going to be part of that review. Thomas felt relief wash over him, so intense it was almost painful. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Mitchell interrupted. If you're right, you're going to make a lot of powerful people look foolish. And if you're wrong, your career here is over. Either way, this won't be easy. The resistance, the emergency engineering review Mitchell ordered sent shockwaves through the factory's management. By lunchtime, word had spread that a lowly riveter had gone over Pemberton's head directly to the Air Force liaison, and that Colonel Mitchell had taken his claim seriously enough to halt production on 3 bombers for comprehensive testing. Thomas felt the hostile stares as he walked to the factory floor to the engineering department. Workers he'd known for years looked away, uncertain whether to support him or distance themselves from a man who might be on his way out. Only a few, mostly older workers like himself, offered subtle nods of encouragement. The conference room was packed. Pemberton stood at the head of the table, flanked by the factory's chief engineer and design team. Their expressions ranged from annoyed to openly contemptuous. Colonel Mitchell sat to the side, observing, his face carefully neutral. Gentlemen, Pemberton began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, we've been asked to investigate allegations of fundamental design flaw in our fuel systems. Allegations made by... He gestured dismissively at Thomas, a production worker with no engineering credentials, no aeronautical training, and apparently an overactive imagination. The allegations were made by someone who actually looks at these systems when they fail, Thomas countered, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. I've documented 14 separate incidents of fuel system failure in return bombers over the past 3 months, all showing the same pattern. Anecdotal evidence, Pemberton scoffed. Combat damage, improper maintenance, pilot error. Any number of factors could explain isolated incidents. Then explain why my model replicates the problem perfectly, Thomas said, placing his demonstration rig on the conference table. This isn't theory. This is reproducible physics. For the next hour, the room became a battlefield of technical arguments. Pemberton and his team attacked Thomas's methodology, his calculations, his conclusions. They questioned his understanding of aerodynamics, thermodynamics, fluid mechanics. Thomas defended each point, drawing on knowledge gained from decades of practical experience and months of intensive self-study. What Thomas lacked in formal education, he compensated for with an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. When Pemberton cited complex equations, Thomas countered with real-world examples from the factory floor. When the engineers questioned his pressure calculations, he demonstrated them with his model, showing exactly how vapor formed under specific conditions. Colonel Mitchell watched it all, occasionally asking pointed questions that forced both sides to defend their positions more rigorously. Thomas noticed that while the colonel's questions seemed neutral, they often exposed weaknesses in Pemberton's arguments. Finally, the chief engineer, a gray-haired man named Carson who'd remained largely silent, spoke up. Regardless of Mr. Green's credentials or lack thereof, his model is compelling. I propose we conduct field tests on actual aircraft under the conditions he's described. Pemberton's face flushed red. That would require grounding bombers, pulling them from combat missions. If Mr. Green is right, Carson interrupted, his voice firm, we're already grounding bombers, permanently, in pieces, scattered across Europe. He turned to Mitchell. Colonel, can you arrange for controlled high-altitude tests? Mitchell nodded slowly. I can have a test crew and aircraft ready within 48 hours. We'll run Thomas's specifications exactly. Temperature, altitude, fuel load, everything. This is absurd, Pemberton protested. We're validating the fantasies of a factory worker who thinks he knows better than trained engineers. No, Mitchell said quietly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. We're doing our jobs, which is making sure that every aircraft that leaves this factory gives our pilots the best possible chance of coming home. He stood, gathering his notes. The test will proceed. Mr. Green, you'll be present to observe. If your theory holds, we'll implement your modifications immediately. If it doesn't, he left the consequence unspoken. As the meeting broke up, Thomas felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. He'd challenged the entire system, staked his reputation and livelihood on his belief. In 48 hours, he'd either be vindicated or destroyed. That night, Margaret found him in the garage, staring at his model. How did it go? She asked softly. They're testing it, day after tomorrow. She put a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing, Tom. No matter what happens, you try to make a difference. But Thomas knew that trying wasn't enough. Not when lives hung in the balance. The test facility at Boeing Field was smaller than Thomas expected, but the tension in the hangar was palpable. A, B. 17 sat on the tarmac, its polished aluminum skin gleaming in the weak winter sunlight. This bomber, designated for testing rather than combat, would be his vindication or his ruin. Colonel Mitchell had assembled an impressive team. 3 test pilots, a flight engineer, and a crew of instrumentation specialists who'd fitted the aircraft with dozens of sensors to monitor fuel pressure, temperature, and flow rates at every critical point in the system. Thomas watched them work, feeling simultaneously awed and terrified by the scale of resources now dedicated to proving or disproving his theory. Pemberton arrived with his engineering team, their expressions making clear they expected this exercise to end in Thomas's humiliation. The senior engineer carried a folder thick with calculations, his trump card to explain away any anomalies that might appear. Gentlemen, Mitchell addressed the assembled group, his tone formal and official. Today's test will follow Mr. Green's specifications exactly. We'll climb to 25,000 feet, reduce temperature in the fuel system using dry ice packs to simulate extreme cold at altitude, and maintain those conditions while running the engines at combat power settings. The lead test pilot, Captain Rick Sorensen, reviewed the flight plan one more time. Thomas had spoken with him briefly before the test, and had been surprised by the pilot's lack of prejudice. If there's a problem with these birds, I want to know about it. Sorensen had said simply, I've lost too many friends to mechanical failures. As the engines fired up, their distinctive roar filling the hangar, Thomas felt his stomach knot. Everything he'd worked for Everything he'd risked came down to the next few hours. He took his position in the monitoring station, surrounded by oscilloscopes and pressure gauges that would tell the story his words couldn't. The B-17 lifted off smoothly, climbing in steady circles as it gained altitude. Thomas watched the telemetry data streaming across the displays. At 10,000 feet, everything looked normal. Fuel pressure steady, flow rates optimal. He could feel Pemberton's smug satisfaction radiating from across the room. 15,000 feet. Still normal. Thomas began to doubt himself. Had he been wrong? Had months of work been based on a flawed premise? The seed of uncertainty grew as the bomber climbed higher. 20,000 feet. The pilots reported all systems normal. Pemberton cleared his throat, a small sound that carried volumes of contempt. Then, at 23,000 feet, as the refrigeration units pushed the fuel temperature down to simulate the extreme cold of high-altitude flight, the first sensor spiked. Fuel pressure at the number 3 engine dropped suddenly, recovered, then dropped again. There, Thomas said, pointing at the display. That's the vapor forming. Watch engine 4 next. As if on cue, the pressure gauge for engine 4 began to fluctuate. In the bomber, Captain Sorensen's voice crackled over the radio, professional but tense. Experiencing fuel flow irregularities in engines 3 and 4, exactly as predicted. Thomas felt no triumph, only grim confirmation. It'll get worse, he said quietly. At combat power settings with combat maneuvers, these fluctuations will become critical. Mitchell ordered the pilots to begin evasive maneuvers. The sharp turns and altitude changes that bomber performed to avoid flak in fighters. The effect was immediate and devastating. The fuel pressure readings went chaotic. 2 engines sputtered, and for a terrifying moment, engine 4 cut out completely before restarting. That's enough, Mitchell said sharply into his radio. Captain Sorensen, return to base immediately. Reduce altitude and maintain steady flight. As the bomber descended and the fuel system stabilized, the monitoring room fell silent. The data was irrefutable. Thomas's theory wasn't just correct. The problem was worse than he described. Under combat conditions, the vapor lock issue could cause multiple engine failures simultaneously. Pemberton stared at the displays, his face ashen. The chief engineer, Carson, was already making notes, his expression grave. Mitchell turned to Thomas, and for the first time, the colonel's military bearing cracked slightly, revealing something like respect. "Mr. Green," he said formally, "it appears you were right, catastrophically right. The revolution, the week following the test, moved with the speed and force of an avalanche." Colonel Mitchell's report went straight to Air Force Command, flagged as critical priority. Within 72 hours, orders came down to halt all B-17 deliveries until Thomas's modification could be implemented and tested. The economic and political implications were staggering. Boeing stood to lose millions in delayed deliveries. Production schedules across multiple factories would need revision. Worst of all, bombers already in service in Europe and the Pacific would need to be recalled and modified, leaving squadrons temporarily understrength during active combat operations. But Thomas's modification worked, and that was what mattered. The bypass valve system he designed, refined now by the engineering team working around the clock, solved the vapor lock problem completely. Field tests on 5 modified bombers showed 0 fuel system failures, even under the most extreme conditions. Senior engineer Pemberton was quietly reassigned to a desk job in procurement. The official explanation was reorganization, but everyone knew the truth. He let pride and prejudice blind him to a critical flaw, and his dismissal served as a message throughout the aviation industry. Expertise came in many forms, and dismissing knowledge because its source could have deadly consequences. For Thomas, life changed in ways he never anticipated. Colonel Mitchell insisted he be hired as a special consultant to the engineering department, with a salary that made Margaret weep with relief. More importantly, his title gave him authority, the ability to be heard when he spotted problems, the respect he'd earned through vindication rather than credentials. But the greatest change wasn't in his position or pay. It was in the culture of the factory floor itself. Workers who spent years quietly noting problems now felt empowered to speak up. Management, chastened by how close they'd come to disaster, instituted new protocols for reporting and investigating concerns regardless of the source. The modifications began rolling out in January 1945. Bombers in the field received retrofit kits, installed by mechanics who'd been given special training on the new system. The results were immediate and measurable. Fuel system failure rates dropped by 78%. Mission abort rates due to mechanical issues fell sharply. Most importantly, fewer bombers were lost to what had previously been written off as mechanical difficulties. In March, Thomas received a letter that left him stunned. It was from a bomber crew stationed in England, the 8th Air Force. They'd heard about Green's fix, as it had become known among pilots, and wanted to thank him personally. Their bomber had experienced engine trouble over Germany, but the modified fuel system had kept them flying long enough to limp back to base. 10 men who should have died or been captured owed their lives to a riveter from Seattle who'd refused to stay quiet. More letters followed, some from pilots, others from crew chiefs, a few from families who'd been told their sons had survived missions that would have been fatal before the modification. Thomas kept them all in a wooden box Margaret's father had made, reading them on nights when he couldn't sleep, when the weight of what might have been pressed too heavily on his conscience. The war ended in September, and with it came recognition Thomas had never sought. He was invited to Washington, given an award he barely understood, photographed shaking hands with generals and politicians who praised his contribution to the war effort. He endured it all with the same quiet determination that had driven him to build that first model in his garage. But the moment that meant the most came to the factory, on his last day before retiring in 1947. The workers on the floor, riveters, welders, painters, assemblers, had pooled their money for a gift. It was a plaque, simple and direct, to Thomas Green, who taught us that the best solutions often come from those closest to problem. Standing in his garage that final evening, Thomas looked at the plaque, then at the worn leather satchel that had carried his model to Colonel Mitchell so long ago. Margaret stood beside him, her hand finding his. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked softly. "All the risk, the fear, the uncertainty?" Thomas thought about the letters in the box, about young men who'd lived to go home to their families, about the pilots who'd learned to trust their aircraft because someone had refused to accept a fatal flaw. "Every moment," he said, "every single moment." The story of Thomas Green became legend in aviation circles, told and retold with variations and embellishments. But the core truth remained constant. One factory worker, armed with nothing but observation, determination, and an unwillingness to accept that expertise was the exclusive domain of the credentialed, had changed the course of the war in a way that was quiet but profound. His lesson outlived him, outlived the war, outlived the very bombers he'd helped perfect. In engineering schools and factories, in boardrooms and design labs, his story became a reminder that innovation doesn't require permission, that truth doesn't respect hierarchy, and that sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person no one expected to speak. They had laughed at one factory worker's ridiculous design, but his secret fix had indeed changed the war, one bomber at a time, one life at a time, one moment of courage at a time.